This is the birthday of Luang Por Chah. The date is 17 June 1918. He was born in Bangkor, a village in Ubon, Rajasthani in northeast Thailand. And I wanted to have this opportunity just to reflect on this marvelous teacher that all of us respect and feel enormous gratitude toward. So I met Luang Por Chah in 1967. I'd already ordained as a bhikkhu in 1967 and met Luang Por Chah after I was ordained. And I was looking for a meditation teacher and one who would be very strict in the Vinaya, because I had this kind of insight previously that I needed to learn how to humble myself, to obey a teacher, to learn to bow, to keep within the restraint of a traditional discipline, because I could see my own nature was very uncontrollable, kind of always manipulated situations in a personal way for my own benefit. And I realized this would be a great obstacle to enlightenment. And I had tremendous faith. I spent the previous year as a samanera meditating on the Four Noble Truths. So upon meeting Luang Por Chah, I felt, this is truly a wise human being. And I felt immediate kind of respect for him, attraction to him, because he had a very ebullient personality. He was very welcoming. And even though he couldn't speak a word of English and I couldn't speak a word of Thai, he seemed to understand me better than anyone else I'd ever met, and in a much more intuitive way rather than just through language discussions. There were two Thai monks at Wat Pah Pong at that time who were proficient in English language, so Luang Por Chah would invite me quite often for tea in his kuti, to exchange our views and opinions about practice with either of these two monks translating. So that's how I became a disciple of Luang Por Chah. His way, the thing that attracted me most of all was he did keep a very high standard of Vinaya, which I wanted to learn, because the previous monastery where I was staying didn't teach me anything about Vinaya, so I never knew how to conduct myself. And alone in my kuti, it was quite all right, but when I'd be invited to laymen's homes or formal situations, I was completely at sea, not knowing what the proper forms of etiquette or expectations were. So with training at Wat Pah Pong, it was very, even though it was very strict, and I didn't always appreciate it, I went along with it, and in the long run, I'm very grateful for the kind of training I received that first year with Luang Por Chah in Ubon. His teaching was one based on reflection, on contemplating the Four Noble Truths. And this I was very interested in, because in the previous year, as I've said before, I was busy contemplating them myself. And so when I began to understand Thai, and then most of the time Luang Por Chah would speak in a dialect of northeast Thailand, that was very different from the Thai that I'd learned, which was more like the central Thai dialect, the Bangkok dialect. But Luang Por Chah was very intuitive person. He seemed to pick up on all kinds of just physical signs, emotion. He knew what emotions I was experiencing, and I didn't have to confess or go to him about things because his advice was always welcomed and always appropriate. And one thing that I had insight before was in the of letting go of the causes of suffering, second noble truth. And so when I began to understand Luang Por Chah's desanas, I began to pick up on, his emphasis on letting go. And that's how I always interpreted his main teaching. Now, different monks have different perspectives on Luang Por Chah's teaching, so I don't discredit that. But how I learned from him was mainly in letting go and seeing the suffering I create by my attachments to my opinions, views, my emotional habits. And during that first year when I was trying to study Thai language, and I'd have to sit through hours of Dhamma talks in the Northeast Thai dialect. I had to experience all kinds of emotional changes because at first, I was quite willing to do it. I determined that this was good for me and that I needed to develop patience, so that the kind of acceptance of it was very rational and very right. But the emotional realities I experienced were, resistance, restlessness, boredom, anger, all kinds of, wanting to leave, thinking it's unfair, criticizing Luang Por Chah in my mind. And Luang Por Chah always encouraged me to be aware of my mental states. He never asked me how my mental states should be. He didn't tell me that I should think in a certain way he wasn't promoting that I should have a continuous respect for him, but to be aware of the actual emotional reaction I was having towards the training, living in a very disciplined monastic community, having to deal with being the only Western monk at the time, feeling lonely, frustrated, confused a lot, not understanding the language, not understanding the culture, just kind of fitting in as best I could, which often, I felt rebellious or resistant toward. But the reason I particularly found this training valuable was Luang Por Chah's encouragement to observe what I was feeling. So this I could do. I couldn't help the feeling. I didn't choose to feel resistant or rebellious or negative, but these kind of emotions, boredom, incredible boredom, physical discomfort, and pain, just happen. They're not intellectual choices or choices one personally makes, but they happen according to time and place and changing conditions. So this is how you learn. You learn to be the witness. The Luang Por Chah's main emphasis to me on his method was very simple mantra, Buddho, the Buddha's name. And in Thai it comes out Puto, which, in English we say Buddha, but in Thai, as I heard it in the Eastern dialect, was Puto, which didn't have the same resonating quality as Buddha, but I began to not make a problem about it and use it because this is the witnessing position. It's not about just devotion to the great Buddha of the past, or just a mantra that you use to quiet the monkey mind, which works. You can just use a mantra to deal with impatience and restlessness by just reciting the mantra inwardly. But the mantra had a tranquilizing effect physically and had a great value on just that, on just recitation. But the emphasis Luang Por Chah was always making was knowing, being this witness, this knowing that it's like this. And so one would have insights very quickly, I found, through this kind of practice. Because, being somewhat of an idealist by my cultural conditioning, I tend to idolize situations, idolize Luang Por Chah, idolize Thai forest tradition, idolize Wat Pah Pong, in terms of always, during the first year, just believing it was the right way, the best way, and I must surrender to it. My ideal of self-surrender, of humility, of humbling myself, were ideals that I valued and cherished and hoped to develop in this life. And so when one was attached to such fine ideals, then when you feel the opposite, when you feel anger, hatred, resentment, and resistance and rebellion, these are not ideals. They don't fit into the ideal structure that I created in my tendency to project ideals onto the monastery, the monks, the teacher I was with. So Luang Por Chah's advice, the Puto, of being the knowing, the witness of the present situation, putting it in the terms of it's like this, rather than trying to suppress my feelings or get caught in guilt or feeling I can't do it, even although these kind of reactions would happen. I feel guilty, I feel I'm not a very good monk, I feel I'd start blaming Luang Por Chah or the monks I was living with. They would go from one extreme to kind of personal arrogance to just feeling worthless. But these are all states of mind that we witness to, you observe, they arise and cease. So during that first year that I lived with Luang Por Chah, I could, even though I missed out on understanding the profound desanas, the teachings that Luang Por Chah was very capable of giving to everyone else, I found just this simple teaching of Puto very important, very valuable way of dealing with the emotional reactions that I had to experience living within a designated structure. So this Vinaya, as Luang Por Chah taught it, was about action and speech. It's not about mental states. So this is very important realization for me about morality, because in my cultural background, which was Christian, sin was also mental and about thoughts and mental states. So I found the moral requirements of the Vinaya impossible to live with, because it was just about action and speech. And I felt I had some reasonable control over that. I could choose to restrain myself and live within the structure that was available within this very traditional form. This is a very ancient Buddhist tradition. And Luang Por Chah's reference to it was always from the Vinaya in the scriptures. So he was well researched and had, first-hand knowledge of the actual traditional structure of Vinaya, which I trusted. But it was all possible to deal with, just to restrain myself in regard to speech and in regard to physical movements and actions, and to live within the Thai system of social etiquette, monastic etiquette, that was very much part of the training. So it gave me a lifestyle, a way of living, in which morally it was quite impeccable, in terms of action and speech. And before I'd been living, as a layman, in a very kind of modern time in Berkeley, California, the University of California, where it was all about following your desires, and there were no kind of polite restrictions. It was the freedom of speech movement in 1962 in Berkeley, and all the kind of emphasis on experience everything, don't be afraid of anything, whatever you think, whatever you feel, express it openly, and it was kind of freedom on one level of action and speech, with no kind of encouragement to restrain oneself in any way. In fact, it was discouraged to going from that kind of life of total promiscuous freedom to the most conservative tradition probably existing on the planet. So I had a lot to reflect upon, because the habit formations, the ego was very much involved with sense of personal importance and personal freedom and rights, and this high sense of self-importance. And all this was, would come up in my relationship to Luang Por Chah and to the other monks, to the lay people that supported us. But the thing that really was very moving, I found, was how well supported Buddhist monks are in Thailand. And because you give up your rights to hold money, and you can't dig in the soil, you can't grow your own food, you have to depend on alms food every day. So you go out on what they call bindabat, with your alms bowl to villages where they put food into your alms bowl. And it was very moving to live in a society that did that, because every day there was plenty of food and freely given, with great respect. And then being the only Western monk that first year, people felt enormous kind of interest. Why would an American, of my age, ordained as a Buddhist monk in the most strict monastery in Thailand was a common question asked. And the answer I'd always give was because of suffering. And that's true, with all the freedom that I experienced in California, it didn't, one still suffered enormously. It didn't bring any kind of self-respect. You began to feel worthless and life didn't have any meaning. Just following desires and whatever those desires may be, and it didn't make you feel any kind of self-respect or importance in your life, but you just felt this is a kind of horrible way to live one's life, just following desires. So my intuition was that I had to train in some kind of tradition that I couldn't control. I just have to surrender to. That didn't give me the rights to make my own choices about action and speech. I had to surrender to this Vinaya structure and the daily routine that was designated at Wat Pah Pong. So that was when I ordained. I didn't quite understand what I was getting into, but learning to live with Luang Por Chah, I began to appreciate this. It was exactly what I needed to live in a way that I was physically very harmless and couldn't follow desires. He lived a completely celibate life. And then the emphasis was on gratitude because you're depending on others for basic needs like food, you feel this sense of gratitude because Thai people seem to be very keen, very eager to feed me, to support my practice of meditation, to support my life as a Buddhist monk. And here I was a complete stranger, couldn't speak their language very well, and yet they gave me this incredible sense of respect and concern and care that I really wasn't expecting in any way from anyone. So I found living in northeast Thailand, in Ubon at that time, very kind of emotionally moving, because this gratitude is very much the foundation of the holy life. When one practices meditation just for oneself, to get rid of your hang-ups and to find peace, that's not a very firm foundation for real peace and freedom, because it is still involved in so many feelings that you never investigate, of your own egotistical habit patterns and your assumptions that come from cultural conditioning. The social conditioning I grew up in was, it was uninvited. You just acquire it as when you're a child, you just take what's given to you. And then in contrast to that, at 33, I was back in kind of infancy again, learning to how to act, how to speak in ways that are harmless and inoffensive and polite and respectful. And how to deal with strong emotions like fear and anger and jealousy and greed of all kinds, because all these emotions arise on the designated core what, or what do you call that, the daily routine of the monastery, you have only one meal a day. And so, that was from someone who was used to having 3 meals a day. This was, you had to deal with this sense of being hungry and fear of losing your health and all kinds of emotional reactions, because at first the food of Northeast Thailand at that time that I was getting wasn't particularly appealing to me. I had to learn to eat what I was given and watch, observe, be the puto, the witness to the emotional reactions I have to this diet, to this kind of food. So during that first year, when people asked me about how I survived, my memories of that first year bring up this immense gratitude. I know I suffered a lot that first year, but it was the kind of suffering that you learn from. It wasn't just brutal, pointless suffering just in a cold-hearted society, or just being caught up in just following emotional reactions without reflection, without understanding. Because in that first year there was plenty of strong emotions aroused. But to deal with emotions, you have to be very patient with them, accept them. Because you can't speak on them, so you can't swear or curse. You can't tell people off. You can't assert your own opinion and shout at people. There's all kinds of rules about speech in the monastic Vinaya. And Thai etiquette is very, very polite, very refined compared to American so-called etiquette. It's quite challenging. And so, one's emotions would arise, very strong feelings of anger and fear and wanting to leave, blaming others, all kinds of fault-finding tendencies, critical mind reactions to the life there, comparing my life in the United States and California with life in Northeast Thailand. The whole cultural conditioning of an American of my generation was reflected in that life that I lived, because it would come up, as mental states, as opinions, as views that I never questioned before, till I had to see them in a different way. So this puto way of practice is being an observer, not the critic of it. So it's not a critical function, it's not about right and wrong anymore, but in terms of feeling, of emotion, of habit patterns that you've developed in your life, it's a witness to that. Because these are all conditions that you acquire after you're born. And puto, awareness, really means mindfulness, awareness, conscious awareness in the present moment. Luang Por Chah's emphasis was always on the present moment, being aware, because that's where we are, for our whole life. When you reflect on it, there's only this present moment is our reality. And the future is imagined, so you imagine things in the future, you make plans, you might live the moment now for the future without realizing it. But the whole emphasis of Luang Por Chah's teaching was to be here and now, to be the puto, the witness to the way it is. And then the traditional restraint was just a helpful container of actions and speech, because with the sense of freedom and I can do what I want and individualism, then, I have a right to, tell people off or show aggression or you feel, stand up for yourself. Don't just be a puppet to others and totally independence and self-importance is so emphasized in the American cultural conditioning, where what I felt and how I felt about things, in my opinion, wasn't important in the tradition I was involved in Thailand. So what do? You either have to leave, because you believe what your mind says, or you observe it. And so you observe this desire to leave or strong views you have about what's right or human rights or personal rights or any formal views, any form of views that you might be habituated toward or habituated to, are seen. They're not criticized. You're not judging them as right or wrong, but on the level of restraint, you don't speak or act on them if they're not within the allowed ways of action and speech within the traditional structure. So on this day, a birthday is always, in the West, is always a celebratory experience. In Thailand, when I first went there, nobody celebrated Luang Por Chah's birthday. And birthdays were not celebrated. But now, in modern-day Thailand, they've been influenced by the West, that birthdays become very important celebration days for all of us. The same here in the UK. And just to remember with enormous gratitude this great teacher who, really directed me, put up with me, trained me, and inspired me as a living example of how a human being can develop within this human lifetime. After birth, you grow up, get old, and die. And that's just the natural movement of conditioned phenomena. And to begin to see through the identity that you have with birth, with the future death, and how strong we have, just my birthday is still a very strong sense of self. I don't remember when I was born. I have no memories of being born, but I know I was, because the result of birth is, this form sitting here on this high seat, giving this Dharma reflection. So that form now is old, and death is not far off. But is this all life is about, is just to be born, grow up, get old, and die? Or is this opportunity that Luang Por Chah encouraged, the real wonder of our human birth, is that within between birth and between the death of the body is this awakening to the reality of Dhamma, to be free from the limitations that all forms of conditioning have placed on us, and to live in this sense of freedom and joy in the reality of here and now. So I offer this for this auspicious day as a sense of gratitude for Luang Por Chah and his teaching and his kindness towards me personally.